Joining us now, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator, good morning. Always good to have you with us. We got a lot to ask you, but I want to start with the briefing that was supposed to be a classified briefing, an update from the administration with you and other senators about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the former Washington Post columnist. What did you get out of that briefing, and has any progress been made in the administration in terms of assigning direct blame to who was responsible?
Well, we got nothing out of this briefing. We have all sorts of classified briefings in which we're told nothing that's classified. This was amongst them. There was no member of the intelligence community at the briefing, so there were a lot of folks who couldn't give us any information. The one thing we did get out of the briefing was a confirmation that the administration does not plan to comply with the human rights law that says when Congress asks for a finding on the culpability of an individual actor overseas, the president has to tell us whether there was a human rights violation or not. The president will not do that when it comes to the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and whether he was involved in the Khashoggi murder. And we now, I think, know for certain that he is not going to comply with that law. And so we have to take matters into our own hands. At this point, the administration is not going to apply any consequences to Saudi Arabia for the way in which they murdered and dismembered Jamal Khashoggi. And we have to. And I think there's bipartisan agreement today, finally, that we have to take some steps with or without the president.
Senator, in fact, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, met with the Crown Prince just last week. Did you get any indication in your briefing that he confronted the Crown Prince with the evidence that points to Saudi Arabia and perhaps the Crown Prince himself ordering the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
We were briefed by two lovely people who had no idea what the White House was doing with respect to their relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's pretty amazing that in the face of this gross violation of human rights, this assault on an American resident, that it's the United States officials that are going to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Nobody from Saudi Arabia is coming here to ask for our forgiveness. And remember, it's not just about Khashoggi. Right now, today, there is another American resident who is in captivity, somebody who is protesting women's rights in Saudi Arabia, a Virginia resident who has reportedly been electrocuted while in captivity in Saudi Arabia. So this isn't just a one-time deal. Saudi Arabia is cracking down on political dissidents, and the administration seems to be cheering that, which means they are going to do more of it.
So what is your best guess, and it's not a guess, it's an informed judgment that you've made based on intelligence and people you've talked to, as to why President Trump and his administration give the benefit of the doubt to the Crown Prince in this matter?
I mean, at some point you have to believe the evidence that's in front of your eyes. The president has been pretty clear that he and his family make a lot of money off of the Saudis. And I don't have any other explanation for why the president seems to have this bizarre policy towards Saudi Arabia in which he makes it look as if we're the junior partner. This idea that if we were to, sanction Saudi Arabia for the murder of Khashoggi, that they would walk away to the Russians, that they would abandon our decades-long alliance is just ridiculous. And so while I don't have a smoking gun in front of me telling me that the president is doing this as a quid pro quo for more rentals in his apartment buildings, it's hard for me to figure out what the other explanation could be.
Well, I'm going to push you to try and figure out what it could be, because at this point I'm sitting here looking at the reality that there are New York Times reports, Senator, that members of the administration very high up had very serious concerns about giving Jared Kushner a security clearance, and that President Trump pushed it through. That's number one. Number two, he has no experience in foreign policy, none, zero, and yet he's being tasked with fixing the Middle East. And number three, he's meeting with MBS alone while the president is off with Kim Jong-un, and there's no question raised, no issue, no information about questions about the murder of a Washington Post reporter, and you, of course, adding that there's a Virginia resident right now in Saudi custody that's being tortured potentially. And Jared Kushner, what exactly is he doing for the American people and for American interests with the Crown Prince? At this time, at this moment in history, what could he be doing with them that is helpful to America and not helpful to Trump's personal financial interests?
No, listen. So you have asked the operative question, and that is part of the reason why it is so important for the United States Congress and the American people to get a full picture of the president's and the president's family's financial records, whether it be through the Emoluments Clause lawsuit or whether it be through subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives. We can answer that question better as to what Jared Kushner is doing in Saudi Arabia over and over again, what he's doing on these private phone calls with Mohammed bin Salman, if we know more about the Trump family's financial interests. And remember, this is also during a period of time in which all sorts of other things are going really wrong in the Middle East. This rupture between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the continued disaster of the Yemen war. It's not as if there's any piece of the U.S.-Saudi relationship that is going well today. So what on earth these meetings are about is hard to figure out, given the fact that everything seems to be upside down with the Saudis, and they seem to be proudly crowing about being in control of their relationship with the United States.
Okay, Senator, you mentioned what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, you've got Syria, you've got Bibi Netanyahu under the threat of indictment in Israel, you've got the war in Yemen. Very few people mention internally what's going on in Egypt, which I'm told is, at the point of rupture, perhaps. So I have a simple, basic mechanical question for you with regard to Saudi Arabia, with regard to the royal family in Riyadh, with regard to the aforementioned Jared Kushner. You are in the minority in the Senate. Is it possible for you to issue a subpoena to people like Jared Kushner to get them to sit in front of you and answer under oath questions that you might have?
So it is not possible for us to do that in the minority, but it is certainly possible for the House of Representatives to do that. And I would hope that they would move forward on doing some serious oversight over American foreign policy, because certainly we have these big questions as to what's motivating our policy in Saudi Arabia. The same is true for our longstanding issues with Trump's Russia policy. Is there financial explanations for that bizarre positioning as well? So we can't issue that subpoena as members of the minority. I don't think the Republicans in charge of the Senate are interested in confronting the president that directly, but the House can certainly do that.
Yamiche?
Senator, you described this idea that you go into these briefings and aren't getting a lot of information out of the White House. Now you have the White House also rejecting document requests. What strategy do you think Democrats in particular in Congress should take to get more questions out of the White House? And do you think people around the president, people who aren't working at the White House, who can't claim executive privilege, what should Congress do to press those people for answers?
Well, I think one of the things we can do is demand that more of these hearings be in public rather than be classified. I think if the American public saw how little information we're getting, there would be more general outrage and more conversation amongst people like you. I mean, unfortunately, you have to rely on us to report that we're not getting anything useful out of these unclassified, classified briefings. But we also don't have to wait for the president. We don't have to wait for more information to reset American foreign policy. We can pass sanctions on Saudi Arabia or on Mohammed bin Salman. We can pull the United States out of the war inside Yemen. We can pass a resolution saying that the president cannot engage in preemptive military action against Iran without congressional authorization. So I also don't think we should be obsessive or too obsessive about information when we can just move forward with the powers that we have that we are not exercising currently.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, thanks so much for your time as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Matt Miller, last thought from you here on the sweeping investigations we've been talking about today. You heard Senator Murphy saying there are a lot of trails that Democrats need to go down now.
There are a lot of trails to follow, and I think when you see Senator Murphy talk, you realize that the scandals involving this administration are not just the corruption scandals involving the president, but they're also policy scandals involving a number of agencies inside the government. I think one of the most interesting things he said is, the president and this administration are just flagrantly, flouting the law on the Magnitsky Act. They are required to respond to Congress if they get a request to investigate. They're required to say whether someone, whether an overseas official violated the law and should be subject to sanctions. And they're just openly, thumbing their nose at that. I'm sure Republicans, as serious as they are about holding the Saudis accountable for the Khashoggi incident, are not going to hold the president responsible for flouting this law. It's going to fall to Democrats in the House. And I think what that means is, we get so focused on the scandals involving this president. There are scandals hiding in plain sight oversight in nearly every agency in the government, and every one of these committees in the House, from foreign affairs to housing to banking, is going to have something very serious to do over the next 2 years.
My question to Senator Murphy, what do you think the odds are that Jared Kushner confronted the Crown Prince last week about this?
Yeah, that low.
Okay. Matt Miller, thank you very much. Good to see you. Still ahead with the federal deficit ballooning. One Republican lawmaker is taking a look at where the government could save tax dollars. Senator James Lankford joins us with the annual Federal Fumbles Report. That's next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.